The Indians were not removed from the location as soon as the municipality secured its ownership. It was necessary to find the residents suitable new quarters before dislodging them. But as the municipality could not easily do this, the Indians were suffered to stay in the same dirty location, with this difference that their condition became worse than before. Having ceased to be proprietors, they became tenants of the municipality, with the result that their surroundings became more insanitary than ever. When they were proprietors, they had to maintain some sort of cleanliness, if only for fear of the law. The municipality had no such fear. The number of tenants increased, and with them the squalor and the disorder. While the Indians were fretting over this state of things, there was a sudden outbreak of the Black Plague, also called the pneumonic plague, more terrible and fatal than the bubonic. Fortunately, it was not the location, but one of the gold mines in the vicinity of Johannesburg that was responsible for the outbreak. The workers in this mine were, for the most part, Negroes, for whose cleanliness their white employers were solely responsible. There were a few Indians also working in connection with the mine, 23 of whom suddenly caught the infection and returned one evening to their quarters in the location with an acute attack of the plague. Sergeant Madanjit, who was then canvassing subscribers for Indian Opinion and realizing subscriptions, happened to be in the location at this moment. He was a remarkably fearless man. His heart wept to see these victims, and he sent a pencil note to me to the following effect. There has been a sudden outbreak of the Black Plague. You must come immediately and take prompt measures, otherwise we must be prepared for dire consequences. Please come immediately. Sergeant Madanjit bravely broke open the lock of a vacant house and put all the patients there. I cycled to the location and wrote to the town clerk to inform him of the circumstances in which we had taken possession of the house. Dr. William Godfrey, who was practicing in Johannesburg, ran to the rescue as soon as he got the news and became both nurse and doctor to the patients. But 23 patients were more than 3 of us could cope with. It is my faith, based on experience, that if one's heart is pure, calamity brings in its train men and measures to fight it. I had at that time 4 Indians in my office, Sergeants Kalyandas, Maniklal, Gunwantrai Desai and another whose name I cannot recollect. Kalyandas had been entrusted to me by his father. In South Africa, I have rarely come across anyone more obliging and willing to render implicit obedience than Kalyandas. Fortunately, he was unmarried then, and I did not hesitate to impose on him duties involving risks, however great. Maniklal I had secured in Johannesburg. He too, so far as I can remember, was unmarried. So I decided to sacrifice all 4, call them clerks, co-workers or sons. There was no need at all to consult Kalyan Das. The others expressed their readiness as soon as they were asked. "Where are you? We will also be," was their short and sweet reply. Mr. Rich had a large family. He was ready to take the plunge, but I prevented him. I had not the heart to expose him to the risk, so he attended to the work outside the danger zone. It was a terrible night, that night of vigil and nursing. I had nursed a number of patients before, but never any attacked by the Black Plague. Dr. Godfrey's pluck proved infectious. There was not much nursing required. To give them their doses of medicine, to attend to their wants, to keep them and their beds clean and tidy, and to cheer them up was all that we had to do. The indefatigable zeal and fearlessness with which the youths worked rejoiced me beyond measure. One could understand the bravery of Dr. Godfrey and of an experienced man like Sergeant Madanjit, but the spirit of these callow youths. So far as I can recollect, we pulled all the patients through that night. But the whole incident, apart from its pathos, is of such absorbing interest and, for me, of such religious value that I must devote to it at least 2 more chapters. The town clerk expressed his gratitude to me for having taken charge of the vacant house and the patients. He frankly confessed that the town council had no immediate means to cope with such an emergency, but promised that they would render all the help in their power. Once awakened to a sense of their duty, the municipality made no delay in taking prompt measures. The next day they placed a vacant godown at my disposal and suggested that the patients be removed there, but the municipality did not undertake to clean the premises. The building was unkempt and unclean. We cleaned it up ourselves, raised a few beds and other necessaries through the offices of charitable Indians, and improvised a temporary hospital. The municipality lent the services of a nurse who came with brandy and other hospital equipment. Dr. Godfrey still remained in charge. The nurse was a kindly lady and would fain have attended to the patients, but we rarely allowed her to touch them lest she should catch the contagion. We had instructions to give the patients frequent doses of brandy. The nurse even asked us to take it for precaution, just as she was doing herself. But none of us would touch it. I had no faith in its beneficial effect even for the patients. With the permission of Dr. Godfrey, I put 3 patients who were prepared to do without brandy under the earth treatment, applying wet earth bandages to their heads and chests. 2 of these were saved. The other 20 died in the godown. Meanwhile, the municipality was busy taking other measures. There was a lazaretto for contagious diseases about 7 miles from Johannesburg. The 2 surviving patients were removed to tents near the lazaretto, and arrangements were made for sending any fresh cases there. We were thus relieved of our work. In the course of a few days, we learnt that the good nurse had an attack and immediately succumbed. It is impossible to say how the 2 patients were saved and how we remained immune, but the experience enhanced my faith in earth treatment as also my skepticism of the efficacy of brandy even as a medicine. I know that neither this faith nor this skepticism is based upon any solid grounds, but I still retain the impression which I then received and have therefore thought it necessary to mention it here. On the outbreak of the plague, I had addressed a strong letter to the press, holding the municipality guilty of negligence after the location came into its possession and responsible for the outbreak of the plague itself. This letter secured me Mr. Henry Polak, who was partly responsible for the friendship of the late Reverend Joseph Doak. I have said in an earlier chapter that I used to have my meals at a vegetarian restaurant. Here I met Mr. Albert West. We used to meet in this restaurant every evening and go out walking after dinner. Mr. West was a partner in a small printing concern. He read my letter in the press about the outbreak of the plague and, not finding me in the restaurant, felt uneasy. My co-workers and I had reduced our diet since the outbreak, as I had long made it a rule to go on a light diet during epidemics. In these days I had therefore given up my evening dinner. Lunch also I would finish before the other guests arrived. I knew the proprietor of the restaurant very well, and I had informed him that, as I was engaged in nursing the plague patients, I wanted to avoid the contact of friends as much as possible. Not finding me in the restaurant for a day or two, Mr. West knocked at my door early one morning, just as I was getting ready to go out for a walk. As I opened the door, Mr. West said, "I did not find you in the restaurant and was really afraid lest something should have happened to you. So I decided to come and see you in the morning in order to make sure of finding you at home. Well, here I am at your disposal. I am ready to help in nursing the patients. You know that I have no one depending on me." I expressed my gratitude and, without taking even a second to think, replied, "I will not have you as a nurse. If there are no more cases, we shall be free in a day or two. There is one thing, however." "Yes, what is it?" "Could you take charge of the Indian opinion press at Durban? Mr. Madanjit is likely to be engaged here, and someone is needed at Durban. If you could go, I should feel quite relieved on that score." "You know that I have a press. Most probably I shall be able to go, but may I give my final reply in the evening? We shall talk it over during our evening walk." I was delighted. We had the talk. He agreed to go. Salary was no consideration to him, as money was not his motive. But a salary of £10 per month and a part of the profits, if any, was fixed up. The very next day, Mr. West left for Durban by the evening mail, entrusting me the recovery of his dues. From that day until the time I left the shores of South Africa, he remained a partner of my joys and sorrows. Mr. West belonged to a peasant family in Louth, Lincolnshire. He had an ordinary school education, but had learnt a good deal in the school of experience and by dint of self-help. I have always known him to be a pure, sober, God-fearing, humane Englishman. We shall know more of him and his family in the chapters to follow. Though my co-workers and I were relieved of the charge of the patients, there remained many things arising out of the Black Plague still to be dealt with. I have referred to the negligence of the municipality regarding the location, but it was wide awake so far as the health of its white citizens were concerned. It had spent large amounts for the preservation of their health, and now it poured forth money like water in order to stamp out the plague. In spite of the many sins of omission and commission against the Indians that I had laid at the door of the municipality, I could not help commending its solicitude for the white citizens, and I rendered it as much help as I could in its laudable efforts. I have an impression that if I had withheld my cooperation, the task would have been more difficult for the municipality, and that it would not have hesitated to use armed force and do its worst. But all that was averted. The municipal authorities were pleased at the Indians' behavior, and much of the future work regarding plague measures was simplified. I used all the influence I could command with the Indians to make them submit to the requirements of the municipality. It was far from easy for the Indians to go all that length, but I do not remember anyone having resisted my advice. The location was put under a strong guard, passage in and out being made impossible without permission. My co-workers and I had free permits of entry and exit. The decision was to make the whole location population vacate and live under canvas for 3 weeks in an open plain about 13 miles from Johannesburg, and then to set fire to the location. To settle down under canvas with provisions and other necessaries was bound to take some time, and a guard became necessary during the interval. The people were in a terrible fright, but my constant presence was a consolation to them. Many of the poor people used to hoard their scanty savings underground. This had to be unearthed. They had no bank, they knew none. I became their banker. Streams of money poured into my office. I could not possibly charge any fees for my labors in such a crisis. I coped with the work somehow. I knew my bank manager very well. I told him that I should have to deposit these monies with him. The banks were by no means anxious to accept large amounts of copper and silver. There was also the fear of bank clerks refusing to touch the money coming from a plague-affected area. But the manager accommodated me in every way. It was decided to disinfect all the money before sending it to the bank. So far as I can remember, nearly 60,000 pounds were thus deposited. I advised such of the people as had enough money to place it as a fixed deposit, and they accepted the advice. The result was some of them became accustomed to invest their money in banks. The location residents were removed by special train to Klipspruit farm near Johannesburg, where they were supplied with provisions by the municipality at public expense. This city under canvas looked like a military camp. The people who were unaccustomed to this camp life were distressed and astonished over the arrangements. But they did not have to put up with any particular inconvenience. I used to cycle out to them daily. Within 24 hours of their stay, they forgot all their misery and began to live merrily. Whenever I went there, I found them enjoying themselves with song and mirth. 3 weeks' stay in the open air evidently improved their health. So far as I recollect, the location was put to the flames on the very next day after the evacuation. The municipality showed not the slightest inclination to save anything from the conflagration. About this very time, and for the same reason, the municipality burnt down all its timber in the market and sustained a loss of some 10,000 pounds. The reason for this drastic step was the discovery of some dead rats in the market. The municipality had to incur heavy expenditure, but it successfully arrested the further progress of the plague, and the city once more breathed freely. The Black Plague enhanced my influence with the poor Indians and increased my business and my responsibility. Some of the new contacts with Europeans became so close that they added considerably to my moral obligations. I made the acquaintance of Mr. Polak in the vegetarian restaurant just as I had made that of Mr. West. One evening, a young man dining at a table a little way off sent me his card expressing a desire to see me. I invited him to come to my table, which he did. "I am sub-editor of The Critic," he said. "When I read your letter to the press about the plague, I felt a strong desire to see you. I am glad to have this opportunity." Mr. Polak's candor drew me to him. The same evening we got to know each other. We seemed to hold closely similar views on the essential things of life. He liked simple life. He had a wonderful faculty of translating into practice anything that appealed to his intellect. Some of the changes that he had made in his life were as prompt as they were radical. Indian opinion was getting more and more expensive every day. The very first report from Mr. West was alarming. He wrote, "I do not expect the concern to yield the profit that you had thought probable. I am afraid there may be even a loss. The books are not in order. There are heavy arrears to be recovered, but one cannot make head or tail of them. Considerable overhauling will have to be done. But all this need not alarm you. I shall try to put things right as best as I can. I remain on whether there is profit or not." Mr. West might have left when he discovered that there was no profit, and I could not have blamed him. In fact, he had a right to arraign me for having described the concern as profitable without proper proof. But he never so much as uttered one word of complaint. I have, however, an impression that this discovery led Mr. West to regard me as credulous. I had simply accepted Sergeant Madanjit's estimate without caring to examine it and told Mr. West to expect a profit. I now realize that a public worker should not make statements of which he has not made sure. Above all, a votary of truth must exercise the greatest caution. To allow a man to believe a thing which one has fully verified is to compromise truth. I am pained to have to confess that, in spite of this knowledge, I have not quite conquered my credulous habit, for which my ambition to do more work than I can manage is responsible. This ambition has often been a source of worry more to my co-workers than to myself. On receipt of Mr. West's letter, I left for Natal. I had taken Mr. Polak into my fullest confidence. He came to see me off at the station and left with me a book to read during the journey, which he said I was sure to like. It was Ruskin's Unto This Last. The book was impossible to lay aside once I had begun it. It gripped me. Johannesburg to Durban was a 24 hours journey. The train reached there in the evening. I could not get any sleep that night. I determined to change my life in accordance with the ideals of the book. This was the first book of Ruskin I had ever read. During the days of my education, I had read practically nothing outside textbooks, and after I launched into active life, I had very little time for reading. I cannot therefore claim much book knowledge. However, I believe I have not lost much because of this enforced restraint. On the contrary, the limited reading may be said to have enabled me thoroughly to digest what I did read. Of these books, the one that brought about an instantaneous and practical transformation in my life was Unto This Last. I translated it later into Gujarati, entitling it Sarvodaya, the welfare of all. I believe that I discovered some of my deepest convictions reflected in this great book of Ruskin, and that is why it so captured me and made me transform my life. A poet is one who can call forth the good latent in the human breast. Poets do not influence all alike, for everyone is not evolved in an equal measure. The teaching of Unto This Last I understood to be: Number 1. That the good of the individual is contained in the good of all. Number 2. That the lawyer's work has the same value as the barber's, inasmuch as all have the same right of earning their livelihood from their work. Number 3. That a life of labor, that is, the life of the tiller of the soil and the handicraftsman, is the life worth living. The first of these I knew. The second I had dimly realized. The third had never occurred to me. Unto This Last made it as clear as daylight for me that the second and the third were contained in the first. I arose with the dawn, ready to reduce these principles to practice. I talked over the whole thing with Mr. West, described to him the effect Unto This Last had produced on my mind, and proposed that Indian opinion should be removed to a form on which everyone should labor, drawing the same living wage and attending to the press work in spare time. Mr. West approved of the proposal, and £3 was laid down as the monthly allowance per head, irrespective of color or nationality. But it was a question whether all the 10 or more workers in the press would agree to go and settle in an out-of-the-way farm and be satisfied with bare maintenance. We therefore proposed that those who could not fit in with the scheme should continue to draw their salaries and gradually try to reach the ideal of becoming members of the settlement. I talked to the workers in the terms of this proposal. It did not appeal to Sergeant Madanjit, who considered my proposal to be foolish and held that it would ruin a venture on which he had staked his all. That the workers would bolt, Indian opinion would come to a stop, and the press would have to be closed down. Among the men working in the press was Chaganlal Gandhi, one of my cousins. I had put the proposal to him at the same time as to West. He had a wife and children, but he had from childhood chosen to be trained and to work under me. He had full faith in me. So, without any argument, he agreed to the scheme and has been with me ever since. The machinist Govindaswamy also fell in with the proposal. The rest did not join the scheme but agreed to go wherever I removed the press. I did not think I took more than 2 days to fix up these matters with the men. Thereafter, I at once advertised for a piece of land situated near a railway station in the vicinity of Durban. An offer came in respect of Phoenix. Mr. West and I went to inspect the estate. Within a week, we purchased 20 acres of land. It had a nice little spring and a few orange and mango trees. Adjoining it was a piece of 80 acres which had many more fruit trees and a dilapidated cottage. We purchased this too, the total cost being £1,000. The late Mr. Rustamji always supported me in such enterprises. He liked the project. He placed at my disposal second-hand corrugated iron sheets of a big godown and other building material with which we started work. Some Indian carpenters and masons who had worked with me in the Boer War helped me in erecting a shed for the press. This structure, which was 75 feet long and 50 feet broad, was ready in less than a month. Mr. West and others, at great personal risk, stayed with the carpenters and masons. The place, uninhabited and thickly overgrown with grass, was infested with snakes and obviously dangerous to live in. At first all lived under canvas. We carted most of our things to Phoenix in about a week. It was 14 miles from Durban and 2.5 miles from Phoenix station. Only one issue of Indian opinion had to be printed outside in the Mercury press. I now endeavored to draw to Phoenix those relations and friends who had come with me from India to try their fortune and who were engaged in business of various kinds. They had come in search of wealth, and it was therefore difficult to persuade them, but some agreed. Of these I can single out here only Manganlal Gandhi's name. The others went back to business. Manganlal Gandhi left his business for good to cast in his lot with me, and by ability, sacrifice and devotion stands foremost among my original co-workers in my ethical experiments. As a self-taught handicraftsman, his place among them is unique. Thus, the Phoenix settlement was started in 1904, and there, in spite of numerous odds, Indian opinion continues to be published. But the initial difficulties, the changes made, the hopes and the disappointments demand a separate chapter. It was no easy thing to issue the first number of Indian opinion from Phoenix. Had I not taken 2 precautions, the first issue would have had to be dropped or delayed. The idea of having an engine to work the press had not appealed to me. I had thought that hand power would be more in keeping with an atmosphere where agricultural work was also to be done by hand. But as the idea had not appeared feasible, we had installed an oil engine. I had, however, suggested to West to have something handy to fall back upon in case the engine failed. He had therefore arranged a wheel which could be worked by hand. The size of the paper, that of a daily, was considered reduced to foolscape size, so that in case of emergency, copies might be struck off with the help of a treadle. In the initial stages, we all had to keep late hours before the day of publication. Everyone, young and old, had to help in folding the sheets. We usually finished our work between 10 o'clock and midnight. But the first night was unforgettable. We had got out an engineer from Durban to put up the engine and set it going. He and West tried their hardest, but in vain. Everyone was anxious. West, in despair, at last came to me with tears in his eyes and said, "The engine will not work. I am afraid we cannot issue the paper in time." If that is the case, we cannot help it. No use shedding tears. Let us do whatever else is humanly possible. What about the handwheel? I said, comforting him. Where have we the men to work? He replied. We are not enough to cope with the job. It requires relays of 4 men each, and our own men are all tired. Building work had not yet been finished, so the carpenters were still with us. They were sleeping on the press floor. I said, pointed to them, "But can't we make use of these carpenters? And we may have a whole night of work. I think this device is still open to us." I dare not wake up the carpenters, and our men are really too tired, said West. Well, that is for me to negotiate, said I. Then it is possible that we may get through the work, West replied. I woke up the carpenters and requested their cooperation. They needed no pressure. They said, "If we cannot be called upon in an emergency, what use are we? You rest yourselves and we will work the wheel. For us it is easy work." Our own men were of course ready. West was greatly delighted and started singing a hymn as we set to work. I partnered the carpenters, all the rest joined turn by turn, and thus we went on until 7 a.m. There was still a good deal to do. I therefore suggested to West that the engineer might now be asked to get up and try again to start the engine, so that if we succeeded we might finish in time. West woke him up and he immediately went into the engine room. And lo and behold, the engine worked almost as soon as he touched it. The whole press rang the peals of joy. How can this be? How is it that all our labors last night were of no avail, and this morning it has been set going as though there was nothing wrong with it? I inquired. It is difficult to say, said West or the engineer. I forget which. Machines also sometimes seem to behave as though they required rest like us. For me, the failure of the engine had come as a test for us all, and its working in the nick of time as the fruit of our honest and earnest labors. The copies were dispatched in time and everyone was happy. This initial insistence ensured the regularity of the paper and created an atmosphere of self-reliance in Phoenix. There came a time we deliberately gave up the use of the engine and worked with hand power only. Those were, to my mind, the days of the highest moral uplift for Phoenix. It has always been my regret that, although I started the settlement at Phoenix, I could stay there only for brief periods. My original idea had been gradually to retire from practice, go and live at the settlement, earn my livelihood by manual work there, and find the joy of service in the fulfillment of Phoenix. But it was not to be. I have found by experience that man makes his plans to be often upset by God, but at the same time, where the ultimate goal is the search of truth, no matter how a man's plans are frustrated, the issue is never injurious and often better than anticipated. The unexpected turn that Phoenix took and the unexpected happenings were certainly not injurious, though it is difficult to say that they were better than our original expectations. In order to enable every one of us to make a living by manual labor, we parceled out the land round the press in pieces of 3 acres each. One of these fell to my lot. On all these plots we, much against our wish, built houses with corrugated iron. Our desire had been to have mud huts thatched with straw or small brick houses such as would become ordinary peasants, but it could not be. They would have been more expensive and would have meant more time, and everyone was eager to settle down as soon as possible. The editor was still Mansuklal Nazar. He had not accepted the new scheme and was directing the paper from Durban, where there was a branch office for Indian opinion. Though we had paid compositors, the idea was for every member of the settlement to learn typesetting, the easiest, if the most tedious, of the processes in a printing press. Those, therefore, who did not already know the work learnt it. I remained a dunce to the last. Maganlal Gandhi surpassed us all. Though he had never before worked in a press, he became an expert compositor and not only achieved great speed but, to my agreeable surprise, quickly mastered all the other branches of press work. I have always thought that he was not conscious of his own capacity. We had hardly settled down, the buildings were hardly ready, when I had to leave the newly constructed nest and go to Johannesburg. I was not in a position to allow the work there to remain without attention for any length of time. On return to Johannesburg, I informed Polak of the important changes I had made. His joy knew no bounds when he learnt that the loan of his book had been so fruitful. "Is it not possible," he asked, "for me to take part in the new venture?" "Certainly," said I. "You may if you like to join the settlement." "I am quite ready," he replied, "if you will admit me." His determination captured me. He gave a month's notice to his chief to be relieved from the critic and reached Phoenix in due course. By his sociability he won the hearts of all and soon became a member of the family. Simplicity was so much a part of his nature that, far from feeling the life at Phoenix in any way strange or hard, he took to it like a duck takes to water. But I could not keep him there long. Mr. Rich had decided to finish his legal studies in England, and it was impossible for me to bear the burden of the office single-handed, so I suggested to Polak that he should join the office and qualify as an attorney. I had thought that ultimately both of us would retire and settle at Phoenix, but that never came to pass. Polak's was such a trustful nature that when he reposed his confidence in a friend, he would try to agree with him instead of arguing with him. He wrote to me from Phoenix that, though he loved the life there, was perfectly happy, and had hopes of developing the settlement, still he was ready to leave and join the office to qualify as an attorney if I thought that thereby we should more quickly realize our ideals. I heartily welcomed the letter. Polak left Phoenix, came to Johannesburg, and signed his articles with me. About the same time, a Scotch theosophist, whom I had been coaching for a local legal examination, also joined as an articled clerk on my inviting him to follow Polak's example. His name was Mr. McIntyre. Thus, with the laudable object of quickly realizing the ideals at Phoenix, I seemed to be going deeper and deeper into a contrary current, and had God not willed otherwise, I should have found myself entrapped in this net spread in the name of simple life. It will be after a few more chapters that I shall describe how I and my ideals were saved in a way no one had imagined or expected. I had now given up all hope of returning to India in the near future. I had promised my wife that I would return home within a year. The year was gone without any prospect of my return, so I decided to send for her and the children. On the boat bringing them to South Africa, Ram Das, my third son, broke his arm while playing with the ship's captain. The captain looked after him well and had him attended to by the ship's doctor. Ramdas landed with his hand in a sling. The doctor had advised that as soon as we reached home, the wound should be dressed by a qualified doctor. But this was the time when I was full of faith in my experiments in earth treatment. I had even succeeded in persuading some of my clients who had faith in my quackery to try the earth and water treatment. What then was I to do for Ramdas? He was just 8 years old. I asked him if he would mind my dressing his wound. With a smile he said he did not mind at all. It was not possible for him, at that age, to decide what was the best thing for him, but he knew very well the distinction between quackery and proper medical treatment. And he knew my habit of home treatment and had faith enough to trust himself to me. In fear and trembling, I undid the bandage, washed the wound, applied a clean earth poultice, and tied the arm up again. This sort of dressing went on daily for about a month until the wound was completely healed. There was no hitch, and the wound took no more time to heal than the ship's doctor had said it would under the usual treatment. These and other experiments enhanced my faith in such household remedies, and I now proceeded with them with more self-confidence. I widened the sphere of their application, trying the earth and water and fasting treatment in cases of wounds, fevers, dyspepsia, jaundice, and other complaints, with success on most occasions. But nowadays I have not the confidence I had in South Africa, and experience has even shown that these experiments involve obvious risks. The reference here, therefore, to these experiments is not meant to demonstrate their success. I cannot claim complete success for any experiment. Even medical men can make no such claim for their experiments. My object is only to show that he who would go in for novel experiments must begin with himself. That leads to a quicker discovery of truth, and God always protects the honest experimenter. The risks involved in experiments in cultivating intimate contacts with Europeans were as grave as those in the nature cure experiments. Only those risks were of a different kind. But in cultivating those contacts, I never so much as thought of the risks. I invited Polak to come and stay with me, and we began to live like blood brothers. The lady who was soon to be Mrs. Polak and he had been engaged for some years, but the marriage had been postponed for a propitious time. I have an impression that Polak wanted to put some money by before he settled down to a married life. He knew Ruskin much better than I, but his Western surroundings were a bar against his translating Ruskin's teaching immediately into practice. But I pleaded with him. When there is a heart union, as in your case, it is hardly right to postpone marriage merely for financial considerations. If poverty is a bar, poor men can never marry. And then you are now staying with me. There is no question of household expenses. I think you should get married as soon as possible. As I have said in a previous chapter, I had never to argue a thing twice with Polak. He appreciated the force of my argument and immediately opened correspondence on the subject with Mrs. Polak, who was then in England. She gladly accepted the proposal and in a few months reached Johannesburg. Any expense over the wedding was out of the question. Not even a special dress was thought necessary. They needed no religious rites to seal the bond. Mrs. Polak was a Christian by birth and Polak a Jew. Their common religion was the religion of ethics. I may mention in passing an amusing incident in connection with this wedding. The registrar of European marriages in the Transvaal could not register between black or colored people. In the wedding in question, I acted as the best man. Not that we could not have got a European friend for the purpose, but Polak would not brook the suggestion. So we three went to the registrar of marriages. How could he be sure that the parties to a marriage in which I acted as the best man would be whites? He proposed to postpone registration pending inquiries. The next day was a Sunday. The day following was New Year's Day, a public holiday. To postpone the date of a solemnly arranged wedding on such a flimsy pretext was more than one could put up with. I knew the chief magistrate, who was head of the registration department. So I appeared before him with the couple. He laughed and gave me a note to the registrar, and the marriage was duly registered. Up to now, the Europeans living with us had been more or less known to me before. But now an English lady who was an utter stranger to us entered the family. I do not remember our ever having had a difference with the newly married couple, but even if Mrs. Polak and my wife had some unpleasant experience, they would have been no more than what happened in the best regulated, homogeneous families. And let it be remembered that mine would be considered as an essentially heterogeneous family, where people of all kinds and temperaments were freely admitted. When we come to think of it, the distinction between heterogeneous and homogeneous is discovered to be merely imaginary. We are all one family. I had better celebrate West's wedding also in this chapter. At this stage of my life, my ideas about brahmacharya had not fully matured, and so I was interesting myself in getting all my bachelor friends married. When in due course West made a pilgrimage to Louth to see his parents, I advised him to return married if possible. Phoenix was the common home, and as we were all supposed to have become farmers, we were not afraid of marriage and its usual consequences. West returned with Mrs. West, a beautiful young lady from Leicester. She came of a family of shoemakers working in a Leicester factory. I have called her beautiful because it was her moral beauty that at once attracted me. True beauty, after all, consists in purity of heart. With Mr. West had come his mother-in-law too. The old lady is still alive. She put us all to shame by her industry and her buoyant, cheerful nature. In the same way as I persuaded these European friends to marry, I encouraged the Indian friends to send for their families from home. Phoenix thus developed into a little village, half a dozen families having come and settled and begun to increase there. It has already been seen that though household expenses were heavy, the tendency towards simplicity began in Durban. But the Johannesburg house came in for much severer overhauling in the light of Ruskin's teaching. I introduced as much simplicity as was possible in a barrister's house. It was impossible to do without a certain amount of furniture. The change was more internal than external. The liking for doing personally all the physical labor increased. I therefore began to bring my children also under that discipline. Instead of buying baker's bread, we began to prepare unleavened wholemeal bread at home according to Kuhne's recipe. Common mill flour was no good for this, and the use of hand-ground flour, it was thought, would ensure more simplicity, health and economy. So I purchased a hand mill for £7. The iron wheel was too heavy to be tacked by one man, but easy for two. Polak and I and the children usually worked it. My wife also occasionally lent a hand, though the grinding hour was her usual time for commencing kitchen work. Mrs. Polak now joined us on her arrival. The grinding proved a very beneficial exercise for the children. Neither this nor any other work was ever imposed on them, but it was a pastime to them to come and lend a hand and they were at liberty to break off whenever tired. But the children, including those whom I shall have occasion to introduce later, as a rule never failed me. Not that I had not laggarded at all, but most did their work cheerfully enough. I can recall few youngsters in those days fighting shy of work or pleading fatigue. We had engaged a servant to look after the house. He lived with us as a member of the family, and the children used to help him in his work. The municipal sweeper removed the night soil, but we personally attended to the cleaning of the closet instead of asking or expecting the servant to do it. This proved a good training for the children. The result was that none of my sons developed any aversion for scavengers' work, and they naturally got a good grounding in general sanitation. There was hardly any illness in the home at Johannesburg, but whenever there was any, the nursing was willingly done by the children. I will not say that I was indifferent to their literary education, but I certainly did not hesitate to sacrifice it. My sons have therefore some reason for a grievance against me. Indeed, they have occasionally given expression to it, and I must plead guilty to a certain extent. The desire to give them a literary education was there. I even endeavored to give it to them myself, but every now and then there was some hitch or other. As I had made no other arrangement for their private tuition, I used to get them to walk with me daily to the office and back home, a distance of about 5 miles in all. This gave them and me a fair amount of exercise. I tried to instruct them by conversation during these walks if there was no one else claiming my attention. All my children, excepting the eldest, Harilal, who had stayed away in India, were brought up in Johannesburg in this manner. Had I been able to devote at least an hour to their literary education with strict regularity, I should have given them, in my opinion, an ideal education. But it has been their, as also my, regret that I failed to ensure them enough literary training. The eldest son has often given vent to his distress privately before me and publicly in the press. The other sons have generously forgiven the failure as unavoidable. I am not heartbroken over it, and the regret, if any, is that I did not prove an ideal father. But I hold that I sacrificed their literary training to what I genuinely, though maybe wrongly, believed to be service to the community. I am quite clear that I have not been negligent in doing whatever was needful for building up their character. I believe it is the bounden duty of every parent to provide for this properly. Whenever, in spite of my endeavor, my sons have been found wanting, it is my certain conviction that they have reflected not want of care on my part, but the defects of both their parents. Children inherit the qualities of the parents, no less than their physical features. Environment does play an important part, but the original capital on which a child starts in life is inherited from its ancestors. I have also seen children successfully surmounting the effects of an evil inheritance. That is due to purity being an inherent attribute of the soul. Polak and I had often very heated discussions about the desirability or otherwise of giving the children an English education. It has always been my conviction that Indian parents who train their children to think and talk in English from their infancy betray their children and their country. They deprive them of the spiritual and social heritage of the nation and render them to that extent unfit for the service of the country. Having these convictions, I made a point of always talking to my children in Gujarati. Polak never liked this. He thought I was spoiling their future. He contended with all the vigor and love at his command that if children were to learn a universal language like English from their infancy, they would easily gain considerable advantage over others in the race of life. He failed to convince me. I do not now remember whether I convinced him of the correctness of my attitude or whether he gave me up as too obstinate. This happened about 20 years ago, and my convictions have only deepened with experience. Though my sons have suffered for want of a full literary education, the knowledge of the mother tongue that they naturally acquired has been all to their and the country's good, inasmuch as they do not appear the foreigners they would otherwise have appeared. They naturally become bilingual, speaking and writing English with fair ease because of daily contact with a large circle of English friends and because of their stay in a country where English was the chief language spoken. Even after I thought I had settled down in Johannesburg, there was to be no settled life for me. Just when I felt that I should be breathing in peace, an unexpected event happened. The papers brought the news of the outbreak of Zulu Rebellion in Natal. I bore no grudge against the Zulus. They had harmed no Indian. I had doubts about the rebellion itself. But I then believed that the British Empire existed for the welfare of the world. A genuine sense of loyalty prevented me from even wishing ill to the empire. The rightness or otherwise of the rebellion was therefore not likely to affect my decision. Natal had a volunteer defense force, and it was open to it to recruit more men. I read that this force had already been mobilized to quell the rebellion. I considered myself a citizen of Natal, being intimately connected with it. So I wrote to the governor expressing my readiness, if necessary, to form an Indian ambulance corps. He replied immediately, accepting the offer. I had not expected such prompt acceptance. Fortunately, I had made all the necessary arrangements even before writing the letter. If my offer was accepted, I had decided to break up the Johannesburg home. Polak was to have a smaller house and my wife was to go and settle at Phoenix. I had her full consent to this decision. I do not remember her having ever stood in my way in matters like this. As soon as, therefore, as I got the reply from the governor, I gave the landlord the usual month's notice of vacating the house, sent some of the things to Phoenix, and left some with Polak. I went to Durban and appealed for men. A big contingent was not necessary. We were a party of 24, of whom, besides me, 4 were Gujaratis. The rest were ex-indentured men from South India, excepting the one who was a free Pathan. In order to give me a status and to facilitate work, as also in accordance with the existing convention, the Chief Medical Officer appointed me to the temporary rank of Sergeant Major and 3 men selected by me to the rank of sergeants and 1 to that of corporal. We also received our uniforms from the government. Our corps was on active service for nearly 6 weeks. On reaching the scene of the rebellion, I saw that there was nothing there to justify the name of rebellion. There was no resistance that one could see. The reason why the disturbance had been magnified into a rebellion was that a Zulu chief had advised non-payment of a new tax imposed on his people and had assegaied a sergeant who had gone to collect the tax. At any rate, my heart was with the Zulus, and I was delighted on reaching headquarters to hear that our main work was to be the nursing of the wounded Zulus. The medical officer in charge welcomed us. He said the white people were not willing nurses for the wounded Zulus, that their wounds were festering, and that he was at his wits' end. He hailed our arrival as a godsend for those innocent people, and he equipped us with bandages, disinfectants, etc., and took us to the improvised hospital. The Zulus were delighted to see us. The white soldiers used to peep through the railing that separated us from them and tried to dissuade us from attending to the wounds. And as we would not heed them, they became enraged and poured unspeakable abuse on the Zulus. Gradually, I came into closer touch with these soldiers, and they ceased to interfere. Among the commanding officers were Colonel Sparks and Colonel Wiley, who had bitterly opposed me in 1896. They were surprised at my attitude and specially called and thanked me. They introduced me to General Mackenzie. Let not the reader think that these were professional soldiers. Colonel Wiley was a well-known Durban lawyer. Colonel Sparks was well known as the owner of a butcher's shop in Durban. General Mackenzie was a noted Natal farmer. All these gentlemen were volunteers and as such had received military training and experience. The wounded in our charge were not wounded in battle. A section of them had been taken prisoners as suspects. The general had sentenced them to be flogged. The flogging had caused severe sores. These, being unattended to, were festering. The others were Zulu friendlies. Although these had badges given them to distinguish them from the enemy, they had been shot at by the soldiers by mistake. Besides this work, I had to compound and dispense prescriptions for the white soldiers. This was easy enough for me as I had received a year's training in Dr. Booth's little hospital. This work brought me in close contact with many Europeans. We were attached to a swift-moving column. It had orders to march wherever danger was reported. It was for the most part mounted infantry. As soon as our camp was moved, we had to follow on foot with our stretchers on our shoulders. Twice or thrice we had to march 40 miles a day. But wherever we went, I am thankful that we had God's good work to do, having to carry to the camp on our stretchers those Zulu friendlies who had been inadvertently wounded and to attend upon them as nurses. The Zulu Rebellion was full of new experiences and gave me much food for thought. The Boer War had not brought home to me the horrors of war with anything like the vividness that the rebellion did. This was no war but a manhunt, not only in my opinion but also in that of many Englishmen with whom I had occasion to talk. To hear every morning reports of the soldiers' rifles exploding like crackers in innocent hamlets, and to live in the midst of them was a trial. But I swallowed the bitter draught, especially as the work of my corps consisted only in nursing the wounded Zulus. I could see that but for us the Zulus would have been uncared for. This work therefore eased my conscience. But there was much else to set one thinking. It was a sparsely populated part of the country. Few and far between in hills and dales were the scattered kraals of the simple and so-called uncivilized Zulus. Marching with or without the wounded through these Solomon solitudes, I often fell into deep thought. I pondered over Brahmacharya and its implications, and my convictions took deep root. I discussed it with my co-workers. I had not realized then how indispensable it was for self-realization. But I clearly saw that one aspiring to serve humanity with his whole soul could not do without it. It was borne in upon me that I should have more and more occasions for service of the kind I was rendering, and that I should find myself unequal to my task if I were engaged in the pleasures of a family life and in the propagation and rearing of children. In a word, I could not live both after the flesh and the spirit. On the present occasion, for instance, I should not have been able to throw myself into the fray had my wife been expecting a baby. Without the observance of brahmacharya, service of the family would be inconsistent with service of the community. With brahmacharya, they would be perfectly consistent. So thinking, I became somewhat impatient to take a final vow. The prospect of the vow brought a certain kind of exaltation. Imagination also found free play and opened out limitless vistas of service. Whilst I was thus in the midst of strenuous physical and mental work, a report came to the effect that the work of suppressing the rebellion was nearly over, that we should soon be discharged. A day or two after this, our discharge came, and in a few days we got back to our homes. After a short while, I got a letter from the governor specially thanking the ambulance corps for its services. On my arrival at Phoenix, I eagerly broached the subject of brahmacharya with Chhaganlal, Maganlal, West and others. They liked the idea and accepted the necessity of taking the vow, but they also represented the difficulties of the task. Some of them set themselves bravely to observe it, and some, I know, succeeded also. I too took the plunge, the vow to observe brahmacharya for life. I must confess that I had not then fully realized the magnitude and immensity of the task I undertook. The difficulties are even today staring me in the face. The importance of the vow is being more and more in upon me. Life without brahmacharya appears to me to be insipid and animal-like. The brute by nature knows no self-restraint. Man is man because he is capable of and only insofar as he exercises self-restraint. What formerly appeared to me to be extravagant praise of brahmacharya in our religious books seems now, with increasing clearness every day, to be absolutely proper and founded on experience. I saw that brahmacharya, which is so full of wonderful potency, is by no means an easy affair, and certainly not a mere matter of the body. It begins with bodily restraint, but does not end there. The perfection of it precludes even an impure thought. A true brahmachari will not even dream of satisfying the fleshly appetite, and until he is in that condition, he has a great deal of ground to cover. For me, the observance of even bodily brahmacharya has been full of difficulties. Today I may say that I feel myself fairly safe, but I had yet to achieve complete mastery over thought, which is so essential. Not that the will or effort is lacking, but it is yet a problem to me wherefrom undesirable thoughts spring their insidious invasions. I have no doubt that there is a key to lock out undesirable thoughts, but everyone has to find it out for himself. Saints and seers have left their experiences for us, but they have given us no infallible and universal prescription. For perfection of freedom from error comes only from grace, and so seekers after God have left us mantras such as Ramanama, hallowed by their own austerities and charged with their purity. Without an unreserved surrender to His grace, complete mastery over thought is impossible. This is the teaching of every great book of religion, and I am realizing the truth of it every moment of my striving after that perfect brahmacharya. But part of the history of that striving and struggle will be told in chapters to follow. I shall conclude this chapter with an indication of how I set about the task. In the first flush of enthusiasm, I found the observance quite easy. The very first change I made in my mode of life was to stop sparing the same bed with my wife or seeking privacy with her. Thus, brahmacharya, which I had been observing willy-nilly since 1900, was sealed with a vow in the middle of 1906. Events were so shaping themselves in Johannesburg as to make this self-purification on my part a preliminary as it were to Satyagraha. I can now see that all the principal events of my life, culminating in the vow of Brahmacharya, were secretly preparing me for it. The principle called Satyagraha came into being before that name was invented. Indeed, when it was born, I myself could not say what it was. In Gujarati also we used the English phrase passive resistance to describe it. When in a meeting of Europeans, I found that the term passive resistance was too narrowly construed, that it was supposed to be a weapon of the weak, that it could be characterized by hatred, and that it could finally manifest itself as violence, I had to demur all these statements and explain the real nature of the Indian movement. It was clear that a new word must be coined by the Indians to designate their struggle. But I could not, for the life of me, find out a new name, and therefore offered a nominal prize through Indian opinion to the reader who made the best suggestion on the subject. As a result, Maganlal Gandhi coined the word Satyagraha. Sat means truth, Agraha means firmness, and won the prize. But in order to make it clearer, I changed the word to Satyagraha, which has since become current in Gujarati as a designation for the struggle. The history of this struggle is for all practical purposes a history of the remainder of my life in South Africa and especially of my experiments with truth in that subcontinent. I wrote the major portion of this history in Yaravada jail and finished it after I was released. It was published in Navajivan and subsequently issued in book form. Sergeant Waliji Govindji Desai has been translating it into English for current thought, but I am now arranging to have the English translation published in book form at an early date so that those who will may be able to familiarize themselves with my most important experiments in South Africa. I would recommend a perusal of my history of Satyagraha in South Africa to such readers as have not seen it already. I will not repeat what I have put down there, but in the next few chapters will deal only with a few personal incidents of my life in South Africa which have not been covered by that history. And when I have done with these, I will at once proceed to give the reader some idea of my experiments in India. Therefore, anyone who wishes to consider these experiments in their strict chronological order will now do well to keep the history of Satyagraha in South Africa before him. I was anxious to observe Brahmacharya in thought, word and deed, and equally anxious to devote the maximum of time to the Satyagraha struggle and fit myself for it by cultivating purity. I was therefore led to make further changes and to impose greater restraint upon myself in the matter of food. The motive for the previous changes had been largely hygienic, but the new experiments were made from a religious standpoint. Fasting and restriction in diet now playing a more important part in my life. Passion in man is generally coexistent with a hankering after the pleasures of the palate. And so it was with me. I have encountered many difficulties in trying to control passion as well as taste, and I cannot claim even now to have brought them under complete subjection. I have considered myself to be a heavy eater. What friends have thought to be my restraint has never appeared to me in that light. If I had failed to develop restraint to the extent that I have, I should have descended lower than the beasts and met my doom long ago. However, as I had adequately realized my shortcomings, I made great efforts to get rid of them, and thanks to this endeavor, I have all these years pulled on with my body and put in with it my share of work. Being conscious of my weakness and unexpectedly coming in contact with a congenial company, I began to take an exclusive fruit diet or to fast on Ekadashi day and also to observe Janmashtami and similar holidays. I began with a fruit diet, But from the standpoint of restraint, I did not find much to choose between a fruit diet and a diet of food grains. I observed that the same indulgence of taste was possible with the former as with the latter, and even more when one get accustomed to it. I therefore came to attach greater importance to fasting or having only one meal a day on holidays. And if there was some occasion for penance or the like, I gladly utilized it too for the purpose of fasting. But I also saw that, the body now being drained more effectively, the food yielded greater relish and the appetite grew keener. It dawned upon me that fasting could be made as powerful a weapon of indulgence as of restraint. Many similar latter experiences of mine, as well as of others, can be adduced as evidence of this startling fact. I wanted to improve and train my body, but as my chief object now was to achieve restraint and a conquest of the palate, I selected first one food and then another, and at the same time restricted the amount. But the relish was after me, as it were, and I gave up one thing and took up another. This latter afforded me a fresher and greater relish than its predecessor. In making these experiments, I had several companions, the chief of whom was Hermann Kallenbach. I have already written about this friend in the history of Satyagraha in South Africa, and will not go over the same ground here. Mr. Kallenbach was always with me, whether in fasting or in dietetic changes. I lived with him at his own place when the Satyagraha struggle was at its height. We discussed our changes in food and derived more pleasure from the new diet than from the old. Talk of this nature sounded quite pleasant in those days, and did not strike me as at all improper. Experience has taught me, however, that it was wrong to have dwelt upon the relish of food. One should eat not in order to please the palate, but just to keep the body going. When each organ of sense subserves the body, and through the body the soul, its special relish disappears, and then alone does it begin to function in the way nature intended it to do. Any number of experiments is too small, and no sacrifice is too great for attaining this symphony with nature. But unfortunately, the current is nowadays flowing strongly in the opposite direction. We are not ashamed to sacrifice a multitude of other lives in decorating the perishable body and trying to prolong its existence for a few fleeting moments, with the result that we kill ourselves, both body and soul. In trying to cure one old disease, we give rise to 100 new ones. In trying to enjoy the pleasures of sense, we lose in the end even our capacity for enjoyment. All this is passing before our very eyes, but there are none so blind as those who will not see. Having thus set forth their object and the train of ideas which led up to them, I now propose to describe the dietetic experiments at some length. Thrice in her life, my wife narrowly escaped death through serious illness. The cures were due to household remedies. At the time of her first attack, Satyagraha was going on or was about to commence. She had frequent hemorrhage. A medical friend advised a surgical operation, to which she agreed after some hesitation. She was extremely emaciated, and the doctor had to perform the operation without chloroform. It was successful, but she had to suffer much pain. She, however, went through it with wonderful bravery. The doctor and his wife, who nursed her, were all attention. This was in Durban. The doctor gave me leave to go to Johannesburg and told me not to have any anxiety about the patient. In a few days, however, I received a letter to the effect that Kasturbai was worse, too weak to sit up in the bed, and had once become unconscious. The doctor knew that he might not, without my consent, give her wines or meat. So he telephoned to me at Johannesburg for permission to give her beef tea. I replied saying I could not grant the permission, but that if she was in a condition to express her wish in the matter, she might be consulted and she was free to do as she liked. But, said the doctor, I refuse to consult the patient's wishes in the matter. You must come yourself. If you do not leave me free to prescribe whatever diet I like, I will not hold myself responsible for your wife's life. I took the train for Durban the same day and met the doctor, who quietly broke this news to me. I had already given Mrs. Gandhi beef tea when I telephoned to you. Now, doctor, I call this a fraud, said I. No question of fraud in prescribing medicine or diet for a patient. In fact, we doctors consider it a virtue to deceive patients or their relatives, if thereby we can save our patients, said the doctor with determination. I was deeply pained, but kept cool. The doctor was a good man and a personal friend. He and his wife had laid me under a debt of gratitude, but I was not prepared to put up with his medical morals. Doctor, tell me what you propose to do now. I would never allow my wife to be given meat or beef, even if the denial meant her death, unless, of course, she desired to take it. You are welcome to your philosophy. I tell you that, so long as you keep your wife under my treatment, I must have the option to give her anything I wish. If you don't like this, I must regretfully ask you to remove her. I can't see her die under my roof. Do you mean to say that I must remove her at once? Whenever did I ask you to remove her? I only want to be left entirely free. If you do so, my wife and I will do all that is possible for her, and you may go back without the least anxiety on her score. But if you will not understand this simple thing, you will compel me to ask you to remove your wife from my place. I think one of my sons was with me. He entirely agreed with me and said his mother should not be given beef tea. I next spoke to Kasturbai herself. She was really too weak to be consulted in this matter, but I thought it my painful duty to do so. I told her what had passed between the doctor and myself. She gave a resolute reply. I will not take beef tea. It is a rare thing in this world to be born as a human being, and I would far rather die in your arms than pollute my body with such abominations. I pleaded with her. I told her that she was not bound to follow me. I cited to her the instances of Hindu friends and acquaintances who had no scruples about taking meat or wine as medicine. But she was adamant. No, said she, pray remove me at once. I was delighted. Not without some agitation, I decided to take her away. I informed the doctor of her resolve. He exclaimed in a rage, What a callous man you are! You should have been ashamed to broach the matter to her in her present condition. I tell you, your wife is not least little hustling. I shouldn't be surprised if she were to die on the way. But if you must persist, you are free to do so. If you will not give her beef tea, I will not take the risk of keeping her under my roof even for a single day. So we decided to leave the place at once. It was drizzling and the station was some distance. We had to take the train from Durban for Phoenix, whence our settlement was reached by a road of 2.5 miles. I was undoubtedly taking a very great risk, but I trusted in God and proceeded with my task. I sent a messenger to Phoenix in advance with a message to West to receive us at the station with a hammock, a bottle of hot milk and one of hot water, and 6 men to carry Kasturbai in the hammock. I got a rickshaw to enable me to take her by the next available train, put her into it, in that dangerous condition and marched away. Kasturbai needed no cheering up. On the contrary, she comforted me, saying, "Nothing will happen to me, don't worry." She was mere skin and bone, having had no nourishment for days. The station platform was very large, and as the rickshaw could not be taken inside, one had to walk some distance before one could reach the train. So I carried her in my arms and put her into the compartment. From Phoenix we carried her in the hammock, and there she slowly picked up strength under hydropathic treatment. In 2 or 3 days of our arrival at Phoenix, a Swami came to our place. He had heard of the resolute way in which we had rejected the doctor's advice, and he had, out of sympathy, come to plead with us. My second and third sons, Manilal and Ramdas, were, so far as I can recollect, present when the Swami came. He held forth on the religious harmlessness of taking mate, citing authorities from Manu. I did not like his carrying on this disputation in the presence of my wife, but I suffered him to do so out of courtesy. I knew the verses from the Manusmriti. I did not need them for my conviction. I knew also that there was a school which regarded these verses as interpolations. But even if they were not, I held my views on vegetarianism independently of religious texts, and Kasturbai's faith was unshakable. To her, the scriptural texts were a sealed book, but the traditional religion of her forefathers was enough for her. The children swore by their father's creed, and so they made light of the Swami's discourse. But Kasturbai put an end to the dialogue at once. "Swamiji," she said, "whatever you may say, I do not want to recover by means of beef tea. Pray don't worry me any more. You may discuss the thing with my husband and children if you like, but my mind is made up."